Resuming debate, the honourable member for Skeena-Balcony Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to my friend, our parliamentary leader in the House. I enter this debate an emergency debate, as many have called this situation with the Kinder Morgan proposal a crisis. And I think for many Canadians, it does represent a crisis. Actually, from both sides, if you want to take at least two sides of the issue, it is a crisis. For those that are in Alberta in the energy sector seeking to move product to market, particularly Asian markets, this represents a crisis of uncertainty and a frustration with a process that was promised to be different, which actually unites people who are on the other side of this issue, who were promised a better process and more clarity about rights and title for Indigenous Canadians, about protection for our environment, and for some understanding of how, as the Liberals constantly talk about, the environment and the economy go together. I represent northwestern British Columbia, and for many of the people I represent, this is a movie we've seen before. When Northern Gateway was first proposed, it met with stiff and consistent resistance as the voices of those who had legitimate questions about the project, about the safety of our rivers and our ocean environment, were rejected, refused, not allowed to testify, and were in fact called at the time by their own government enemies of the state. Foreign-funded radicals. Do you hear some of the similar rhetoric brewing up again? That those who dare to ask questions, that those who dare to pose significant concerns over something that threatens potentially their lives and their communities are somehow un-Canadian. Now, the Liberals came in on a promise to do better than Stephen Harper, and when it comes to the environment in particular, that doesn't seem like it would be all that hard to do. Because when Stephen Harper was in office, he gutted some of our most fundamental environmental protections that had existed for decades. The bar was set very low. He put climate change targets in place that the Liberals called ridiculous and unsatisfactory, the same climate targets that the Liberals can't even meet now. And that the environmental process that these pipelines were going through, that rejected the claims of First Nations, that ignored significant and basic concerns, and I say this to my colleague and friend, the Natural Resource Minister, that when he and his government can't answer a question like the following: does bitumen sink when it hits salt or fresh water, and how, for God's sakes, do you clean it up if it does? They can't answer that question. They couldn't answer it when Northern Gateway was proposed in northern British Columbia. They still can't answer it years later when they're pushing their Kinder Morgan project forward in the south of British Columbia. So how dare the Premier of my province pose such questions? That in the event of an oil spill, like the Kalamazoo spill, in the event of an accident on the sea, like the Nathan E. Stewart, or the one that happened in Vancouver Harbour, that took 14 hours in Vancouver Harbour to find booms to put up the spill, that when my Premier says, how exactly do we clean this oil up when it hits our coastline? And as a Premier, that's his jurisdictional responsibility. Everyone believing in the rule of law? Yes, we do. Is that the Premier's responsibility to protect on behalf of British Columbians? Yes, it is. Would you like to go to the Supreme Court and clarify that? No, they don't. No, let's not clarify those questions, say the Liberals, because they believe in the Constitution and the rule of law, except when the parts that they don't want to observe and acknowledge. We find this frustrating because this new bitumen proposal to move almost 900,000 barrels to our coast, 12 new pump stations, 19 storage units, a 700% increase in oil tanker traffic, through a place that we all recognize as a precious and important part of the world, an important and precious part of the world, that when British Columbians stand for place and pride of place and home, that we are somehow less Canadians. And to my Alberta friends and colleagues, to my family from Alberta, we understand pride of home, defense of family, hope for the future. That is exactly the same conversation we're having in British Columbia. And for a Prime Minister who came in on the hope and aspiration to unite and not divide, when he says, of course we'd rather do it with the provincial government, but we will do it whether or not they like it. When his minister says, we will not tolerate opposition in the House of Commons. Oh, I'm sorry. This Liberal government will not tolerate this. They'd rather work with the provinces, but if not, well, we're going to do it anyways. when they say that they believe in the rights and title of First Nations individuals, and when the Minister of Natural Resources himself gets a briefing in January from his own department that tells him that consultations with First Nations in British Columbia have been the following: paternalistic, inadequate, and unrealistic. And then Liberals are suddenly surprised that they're in court with First Nations, that this little tack-on consultation process, which in some of the First Nations communities, they weren't notified until after the consultation had moved through their community. Wow. This was the consultation process. This is what's being challenged in court. I've got news for the Liberals. They're going to lose that challenge. We have tested this case time and time again. Delgamuukw, Haida, Sparrow, Tsilhqot'in, we have tested this question time and time again. And governments in Canada insist on relearning the lesson over and over again, and somehow blame First Nations for standing up for their constitutional rights, when it's the government and this Liberal Prime Minister who said, there is no more important relationship to me than that with Canada's First Nations people. I challenge that. I don't believe him anymore. I did believe him at one point. And when he told British Columbians, asked specifically, on tape, what will you do with the Kinder Morgan project? He says the review will be redone. We will redo it. And now, 2.5 years later, we have an omnibus environmental bill, a legislation, that has somehow unified environmentalists and oil activists and First Nations all together in their dislike of this bill. Congratulations. There is some unity bone within the Conservatives and Liberals. Excuse me, I get them confused tonight as I watch them violently agree with one another as to who's the best promoter of a project that has significant and real consequences posed. Significant and real risks that the people of British Columbia, on behalf of all Canadians, because all Canadians like coming out to BC, Prime Minister loves to surf, my Alberta family loves to fish. We love welcoming Canada to British Columbia and our beautiful coast. We love talking about how much British Columbia has to offer. But this question of reconciliation, a word so easily off the lips of the Prime Minister, but so rarely enacted with any kind of meaning or effectiveness, is frustrating to people in British Columbia because we believed him when he said he would redo the process. We believed him when he said they would set more ambitious climate targets. We believed him when he said he was going to work and unite the provinces, not to seek to divide. He actually is making the claim that by posing significant and important questions about an oil pipeline, the Premier of British Columbia is somehow ruining the climate change program of the country. Only in Canada could an oil pipeline of almost 900,000 barrels a day be vital to a climate change program. Only in Canada could the Prime Minister stand up and say to a Premier dutifully elected on this promise to raise these questions, to raise the voices of British Columbians. Could we have a country in a situation in which we are somehow less than? This question goes to the heart of us. This question goes to the heart of who we are as a nation. And if we want to be better, if we want to achieve what it was that we set out to do, to bring the country together, to finally and fully reconcile with First Nations people, then you have to listen. Don't list off numbers of meetings and then ignore what people told you. Don't list off the word consultation over and over again and yet not abide by the serious concerns and not address or answer legitimate and important questions that are put to the government. Because it's our coast, it's all of our coast, and we'll defend it. If the government has any doubt in their minds about the seriousness and the diligence and the determination of the people of British Columbia, they are beginning to find out. I ask them not to find out anymore, to listen, refer the question to the Supreme Court, work with the Premier of British Columbia, stop bullying him, and understand that when we stand up for our coast and we stand up for our future generations, we are standing up for all Canadians. Thank you very much.
Questions.